Now this bank here, this is part of the Powell Bank. Now we're on there. And there's two trees. They probably planted on it, the massive yew trees. I call them Adam and Eve.
Right.
I got a name for all trees. Yeah. So we're on the Powell Bank now. And that would have probably been a lot higher than that. Over the years it's sunk down, but it was probably higher than that, and that would have had palings on. Oak palings.
Right.
To keep the deer in, really. But you can just see traces of it now. I mean, a lot of it's no more than a dip in the ground. Those yew trees must be getting on. I reckon those yew trees would be about 800 or 900 year old.
Are they really?
Yeah, and they more than likely they would have been planted when the bank was to actually mark the boundary of the bank.
We're at Pondhead Inclosure near Lyndhurst in the New Forest, and Dave is pointing out the boundaries of a deer park that covered this area in medieval times, long before the creation of the Pondhead Inclosure as it is now. Deer parks were popular in England at a time when venison was already a meat that only the wealthy could afford. They were fenced areas used to raise deer for tables of royalty and the aristocracy. Henry III was especially fond of game. For his Christmas dinner in 1251, Henry III had 430 red deer, 200 fallow deer, 200 roe deer, 200 wild swine, 1,300 hares, 450 rabbits, 2,100 partridges, 290 pheasants, 395 swans, 115 cranes, 400 tame pigs, 70 pork prawns, 7,000 hens, 120 peafowl, 80 salmon, and lampreys without number. In a royal forest like the New Forest, where deer roamed freely over wide tracts of land, deer parks might have been used to round up deer for ease of shooting, either as sport for the royal family, or by the king's gamekeepers for his table. It's said that in the 1300s as much of a third of England was afforested. Afforestation didn't mean that it was woodland, but that it had been designated as the king's hunting ground and was protected by forest law, a practice that was introduced from Normandy by William the Conqueror. The boundaries of the forest were policed by foresters or rangers. But royal forests usually contained much land over which local people had ancient rights of common to graze their own animals. In the New Forest, the Crown had rights over the forest for 6 months of the year, 5 for winter haning, so the deer had less competition for grazing, and a fence month to protect the newborn deer. Commoners could graze their animals on the forest for the other 6 months of the year, but had to have some land where they could put them in the winter. So the royal penchant for venison could cause conflict between king and commoners, who resented the royal deer which competed for grazing with their own livestock. By the late 17th century, however, royal priorities had changed. Instead of venison, what a hard-pressed monarch now needed was timber, especially to build new ships for a struggling navy. Shortly after the Battle of Beachy Head in 1690, when the British had lost control of the English Channel to the French, albeit briefly, there was a general sense of panic in the air. Fearing another invasion by the French, the need to strengthen the navy was a priority, which meant planting more trees to build ships. In the New Forest, areas known as Inclosures were fenced off from grazing animals, both the king's deer and commoners' stocks, until the trees became established. These enclosed areas took grazing land away from commoners and their animals.
Suis amour
The erection of fences was forbidden by law, however, so changes were required through Acts of Parliament. Following a series of such acts, causing resentment among the commoners of the New Forest, the Crown agreed to remove all deer from the forest in exchange for the weakening of common rights and further powers to enclose land for timber, much of which was now commercial softwood. This was made into law through the Deer Removal Act in 1851, and over 3,000 deer were exterminated. Far from solving conflicts in the forest, however, this act made things worse. The Crown was permitted to enclose land on a rolling basis, which meant that an increasing acreage of land was ruined for grazing. By 1877, matters had come to a head, and in Parliament the Lord Chancellor spoke up against the Deer Removal Act, laying out the issues it had caused.
The principle of that arrangement was this. By way of following out the precedent which had been established with the view of promoting the growth of timber, Parliament was asked to extend the principle of that precedent to an extent that had never been contemplated by those who were responsible for it, and to sanction the enclosure of portions of the forest not for the purposes of the growth of timber, but to compensate the Crown for giving up the deer. Now, if it was intended to have compensated the Crown at all, it would have been much better to give it a specific allotment of land. Nothing could have been worse than to give the Crown a rolling right to go from part to part of the forest and enclose land here and there, and to plant fir and other trees to an enormous extent. Every person who visits the forest is shocked to see a mass of hideous black, unsightly fir plantations, which, even if they had come to maturity, will scarcely repay the cost of planting, and which have absolutely ruined forever the best pasture land in the forest.
As a result, an Act was passed in 1877 whereby the Crown was able to keep their 17,645 acres that had already been enclosed, but the remaining 45,000 acres was to be left permanently unenclosed, and commoners' stock could roam freely. There are still enclosures of conifers in the New Forest, and a new act after the Second World War allowed the Forestry Commission to plant more. But as conservation becomes more of a priority than national security, they're gradually being replaced by native trees, and grazing returned beneath them. There's a twist in the tale of Pondhead Inclosure, however. Pondhead had been planted up with oaks for building naval ships in the early 19th century, before the days of large conifer plantations. But in 1860, the first ironclad steamship, HMS Warrior, was delivered to the Navy. Oak as a building material had become redundant.
Right, this is the what they call the broad arrow, and the master shipwright, or the King Surveyor of the Navy shipyards, the Royal shipyards, would come out and he'd mark certain trees up that they wanted to use for the Royal Navy shipyards, and they'd be taken back. But they used to mark them with the King's mark, and the King's mark was the broad arrow. And also on this tree next to it, you've got a circle, and whether this has got anything to do with the arrow or not, but it was done, looks like it was done roughly the same time, but the circle represents the witch's mark. The witches used to use the circle to do the marks. So whether that's any connection to the tree that was marked with the broad arrow, we don't know. And it's the only one I can find with the witch's mark in this part of the woods. But a lot of these trees now that they've marked, this is a beech tree by the way, they would have used mainly beech for the interior of the ships in Nelson's time and before, but and a lot of the beeches they would have used, like I say, for the interior, the knees and the knuckle joints would have been inside the ship. Obviously the hull of the ship, they would have used oak, but again they would have been marked with the broad arrow as well, so they would go for the Navy shipyards. But they stopped doing, they stopped building when the metal hulled ships come in, Navy ships. They obviously the wooden ones went out of fashion because they were starting to do them in metal steel. So the broad arrow marked that they marked the trees ready to go. If they weren't cut when the metal ones ships come in, they were just left in the woods. And as you can see, these trees would have been probably marked in the early 1800s. So you think that's over 200 years ago. So in a life of a beech tree, obviously, isn't as long as an oak tree. So 200, 300, 400 years old for beeches, may go on to 500, 600, but when you think that's go 200-year old, that mark. So they're gradually wearing out, or they're growing over. But he would have been a lot younger, this tree, when it was marked. But as you can see around here, a lot of the trees are blowing out now, and these obviously got to be documented before we lose them, because they are going to go and you're never going to get anything like this again. I started in here seriously, went self-employed in 2004. They wanted someone to look after the woodland and do the coppicing. Of course the commission, they won't bother with it because it's not commercial woodland, it's not timber wood, there's no sort of softwood. And they wanted the hazel coppiced for conservation works. I said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we could start a trust up to keep this wood going? Because there was threats of it being sold off because it wasn't commercial to the forestry. And of course, a lot of their stuff, if it don't make them money, they get rid of it.
Dave and other volunteers from the Pondhead Conservation Trust have restored and maintained the enclosure since 2004.
It's a Saxon boundary bank, that one, so that predates the actual Norman Power Bank.
Right.
So that's one of the oldest banks you'll see on the forest, really. Again, it's only survived because this woodland's never been planted up with conifers or softwood, and they've never had any big machinery in here, really. So it's a unique woodland because it just contains that history, because it's never been commercialised, and so you still got all the old signs in here. Yeah, me and Derek. Yeah, we got an invoice. Still got the letter home. When it was from, when Carol said you got a letter from the Chancellor. Yeah, Buckingham Palace. I've still got the envelope inviting me to. Yeah, I think that's something to show the grandkids, isn't it? Old man of the woods going up to the Buckingham Palace. Oh dear.